Our perspective is probably going to be a little bit different because I'm coming at this from having been in the profession now for about 15 years and thinking a little bit differently about my role in the academy as a queer academic, thinking a little bit differently about my experiences as a queer academic, and also as a queer compositionist. So the subject of what we're going to be talking about in our presentation will largely be about queerness and composition and what we're coming to think of as their incommensurability with one another.
What's interesting about this discussion for me is I have a lot of mixed feelings about the term queer, period. And I've written from a queer perspective, and I've written against queer perspectives, and I have never resolved it one way or the other. I think that that's just something that's always going to be troublesome for me. Because I certainly see the value of queering things, and I think in some of my work I've talked about how queer theory works very well epistemologically to take apart texts and to do things. But it also runs the danger of erasing people. And what it seems to erase for me, and maybe this is a bit provocative, but it seems to erase lesbians. And I'm going to say, well, I don't think it does it on purpose, but who knows? But as I'm looking through even pedagogical Gregory's green sheet here, that we have dykes and faggots and queers and bitches and all this, but there are no lesbians. And I keep thinking, well, that's really interesting. I mean, and again, I'm not thinking you're sitting there going, oh, let's leave the lesbians out. But I think that since I identify as lesbian, and I do that politically and personally, and I will do that as opposed to defining myself as queer, that I find that the lesbian position, we can talk about that after lunch, that the lesbian position to me seems more subversive than a queer position very often. Part of what I thought was interesting when you were talking about Michael Warner and shame is when you start looking at the different intersections of what we might possibly feel ashamed about. When you brought up the issue of class, I thought, well, of course, that's the first thing I'm going to feel ashamed about. It's not going to be my sexuality. It might be my class, it might be my gender, it might be all sorts of things, but I'm not sure if it's necessarily that I'm lesbian because I've grown so used to inhabiting this that that's not the first thing that comes up. But there is definitely shame. There is sort of a useful force for things. I just found it so interesting that once again, I'm thinking, am I queer? Am I lesbian? Am I queer? Am I lesbian? And I think if you look through the MLA programs and the 4C programs, you'll see that there's a great institutional ease with the term queer, which I think is so ironic given its roots. But there's an ease with saying queer theory, and I was making jokes this morning at breakfast about, we can say queer, we're letting little queers come to the table. As part of the nice little charm bracelet of diversity that people are trying to do. But once you start bringing up the idea of, and I guess this is where I will go with the intellectual ideas, that in some ways, queer intellectuals is a natural and acceptable place to be. It's only when you attach bodies to the queers that they become troublesome, because they do things with their bodies that people don't want them to do with their bodies. Remembering that material component of intellectual work is extremely important, not just in terms of who's going to get beat up in the parking lot or who has to worry about being challenged, as I regularly am in the women's bathroom. Or knowing that when you stand in front of a classroom and people know that you're queer, they're already inhabiting your body with sexual practices. They're looking at you and they are inhabiting you with a self that you're not in control of. That sense of the somatic body in intellectual work, I think, is much more subversive in a lesbian way than just queer. And so I'm always at this crossroads, like, how do we deal with this? Because I do believe in the ways that queer theory lets us disrupt things. And at the same time, the lesbian part of me, that I toss in people's faces, but only if I get dinner. But I think that's part that we always have to keep in mind, or I always have to keep in mind, that any intellectual work as a queer is it's doomed to be ungrounded and unsubversive unless we manage to get our bodies into it. And so I think that keeping in mind the sexual self, that as long as they out there can ignore the fact that I like to do things with other women that they don't think I should be doing, as long as they can ignore that, then they're ignoring a key component of who I am. And so that's the challenge, I think, of queer intellectual work, is because the academy is so in the brain and so against the body, and the sort of work that we do has to take into account the body. How do we negotiate a space for ourselves as academics when what we seem to be doing goes directly against the institution?
It's interesting that you were talking about this, because I'm increasingly beginning to think that this is not true just for the lesbian experience. I think it's also very true for a specific gay male experience. I have gone from being very vocally self-identified as a queer person to being much more specifically self-identified, and perhaps aggressively so, as a gay man, because I actually find an increasing, and this is a provocative thing to say, an increasing erasure of gay male sensibility, of gay male aesthetics, of gay male eroticism and sexuality within the academy. And it's interesting and perhaps provocative to say that, because one of the things that queer theory has been accused of is being too male. But I often find that while queer theory, to which I'm very attached, is very epistemologically interesting, it is, as I think Jackie is suggesting, semantically bankrupt in a number of key ways. And not just semantically bankrupt in terms of the actual discussion and the consideration of what people actually do with each other and with what they do with their bodies, but also in how we approach and understand and experience as queer people, or as gays, as lesbians, or as bi people, or even as trans people, our actual profession. I, at the University of Cincinnati, before I moved to California, was for 9 years the only openly gay man in my department. I find at Irvine, I am the only gay man in my department. I'm in an English department, for Christ's sakes. Why am I the only gay man? And at a recent departmental meeting, when we were trying to hire a medievalist who also did queer work, somebody said, "Jesus Christ, we have to hire this woman so Jonathan will have a fucking colleague." And I was simultaneously flattered and incensed. I really wanted to hire this particular lesbian colleague because I thought she actually would do a fantastic job in the position, but I also was kind of reminded that not only am I aware of myself as a very solitary gay man within my department, but others are as well. And what does that mean? What does it mean for them? Does it mean, check, we've got that shit covered? But I've also thought that I have never been hired for my work in queer studies or in queer composition. When I was hired at the University of Cincinnati over 10 years ago, I was hired because of the work that I do in new media studies. When I was hired just recently at the University of California, Irvine, I was hired because of the increasing work that I'm doing in writing across the curriculum. And as I look very carefully at the documents that were used to support my hiring, the immense amount of paperwork that kind of gets funneled up the chain of command, the positioning of my queer work is very, very carefully situated. Now, I think of myself as a queer compositionist, and that's what I do. I think my most significant, my most important for me, scholarly articles and projects have been in queer composition. I am not hired on the basis or on the merit of those particular works. It's on other work hired. And as I have worked with graduate students, I have found myself increasingly talking about that as an issue. That if I'm not being hired on the merit of this kind of work, then really, where is my body? Where is my body in my profession and in my life as an academic? Maybe more importantly, where is my body in terms of composition? Jackie, where is your body in terms of composition?
Is it here?
Where is anybody's body in terms of composition.